In 2017, the United Nations Environmental Programme (UNEP) released a report revealing the extent of environmental damage caused by oil exploration activities of Shell Petroleum in the Niger Delta region of Nigeria. The report detailed the impact of Shell's operations in about 10 local communities where drinking water sources were contaminated, farmlands destroyed, and major sources of livelihood such as fishing were practically crushed. This is classified by many human rights organizations as a violation of fundamental human rights, and repeated occurrences such as this has been a major concern, especially with more investment interest, both foreign and local, seeking to establish businesses in Nigeria. For decades, there has been an international argument as to who was ultimately responsible for addressing possible human rights violations from business activities. On one side of the argument, government authorities should be responsible for setting up policies and laws that prevent or mitigate human rights violations by companies, while on the other side of the argument, the responsibility is placed on the corporations whose activities present a potential risk to human rights violations. In 2011, this fierce debate led to the introduction of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and was unanimously adopted by the United Nations Human Rights Council, which served as an international norm of expected business conduct that applies to all businesses regardless of size. These guiding principles provide a framework on how to improve human rights standards in the business sector, as well as clearly defining the responsibilities of both government and companies to prevent, mitigate, and remedy impacts of business activities on human rights. The UN Guiding Principles, or UNGP, has three main pillars, and they are: state duty to protect human rights, corporations' duty to respect human rights, and access to justice. The first pillar focuses on the government's responsibility by passing laws that prevent human rights violations from businesses and ensuring that those laws are properly implemented. The second pillar is directed at the corporations themselves, compelling them to put in place organizational measures to address negative human rights impacts from their activities. The third pillar addresses both government and corporate role to mitigate, prevent, and remediate any infringement of human rights caused by business operations. Nigeria is one of the countries that have initiated the UN Guiding Principles and as a result has developed a national action plan on business and human rights as a policy framework to guide the implementation of the UN Guiding Principles in the Nigerian business sector. Within the framework of the National Action Plan is the provision for corporations, irrespective of size and structure, to conduct mandatory human rights due diligence processes that adequately address how their business activities are impacting on human rights where they operate. This provision conveniently falls under the second pillar of the UN Guiding Principles, which obligates companies to satisfactorily demonstrate their commitments to respecting human rights. While conducting human rights due diligence within a corporation, there are common principles that need to be put into consideration in line with Nigeria's National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. This is to ensure that there is a process in place to adequately identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for how corporations address human rights impacts due to their operations. One of these common principles, and perhaps the most important, is ensuring that any human rights due diligence process considers all human rights recognized by international laws. Some of these laws include the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, etc. Corporations also need to consider Nigerian local laws in their due diligence processes. There are numerous human rights provisions found in several Nigerian legislations that are already implemented in the Nigerian business sector. These legislations include the Mineral Act, Employees Compensation Act, Trade Unions Act, etc. For example, in sections 58 and 63 of the Labour Act, there are human rights provisions that guarantee an individual's rights to join a trade union, equal pay, and good working conditions. These are some of the many provisions that the due diligence process must cover to be efficient in improving human rights standards within business operations. To develop an effective human rights due diligence process, the National Action Plan and the UNGPs stipulate that corporations must carry out human rights impact assessments on their activities and operations. These assessments should not only be linked directly to the business operations, services, and product, but it must also extend to activities of other contractual partners and other third-party entities within the business supply chains and relationships. This means that companies are responsible for taking deliberate steps to ensure that none of the operations are violating human rights in their host communities, whether these operations are directly from the companies or third-party contractors. For example, a coal mine company could assess how its mining operations will impact people's livelihood, such as farming, within their host communities, even if some of those operations will not be handled directly by the company. Therefore, a thorough screening of all the company's activities, directly or indirectly, must be done to identify human rights risks with adequate measures to prevent or mitigate them. A human rights impact assessment must consider internal human rights impacts as well, ensuring that employees are treated fairly and provided with favorable working conditions, especially when they are employed from within the host communities. In the event of an actual human rights violation by a company's business activities, the National Action Plan for Business and Human Rights, in line with the UNGPs, stipulates that the corporation must provide remediation efforts through legitimate processes. For example, if a coal mine company discovers that its activities has destroyed farmlands, which is a potential source of livelihood for families, the company is obligated to support the victims through the process of getting a remedy for the damage caused. This remedy could involve access to legal support or other settlement and compensation proceedings. The National Action Plan also makes provision on how victims of human rights violations can access justice, especially when a corporation has failed to carry out human rights due diligence. In this regard, the Action Plan clearly states that any person or persons harmed by the breach of human rights or environmental standards shall be at liberty to bring an action against either the business or any of its subsidiaries to take steps to ensure a cessation of the violation and for compensating for the harm that would have been avoided if due diligence had been exercised appropriately. Finally, the government has a significant role to play in enforcing compliance with the National Action Plan as stipulated under the first pillar of the UN Guiding Principles. Government has the responsibility of ensuring that human rights due diligence standards are reflected in government policy frameworks and legislations that guide business activities within the country. The National Action Plan also recommends that government, where possible, should use legislation to create incentives to exercise and advance human rights due diligence, even within state-owned corporations. The role of civil society cannot be overemphasized because a majority of the corporations operating in Nigeria are either not aware or unwilling to take responsibility in upholding human rights standards within their operations. Therefore, considerable efforts need to be taken by all relevant stakeholders to ensure there is adequate respect for human rights according to the UN Guiding Principles. Global Rights has been a keen player in sensitizing the public on the nexus between business and human rights, and you can find out more information on our website.